personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds, and this is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world, the information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest on the show. He is Cillian Kieran, who is the founder and CEO of Ethyca. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Debbie, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So this is interesting. I've been following your company for quite a while. Very impressed by the work that you do. Really like sort of the content and, your image that you put out there. And so I think you're doing something really, really interesting. So obviously you're a data company, but you have ethical bent as well, right? So give me an idea. First of all, tell me about your journey into privacy. Sure. And your journey with this company and what really sort of caught your attention about this area.
Absolutely happy to. So I'm certainly not from a sort of typical traditional privacy background, policy or legal function. My background is data and software engineering for my entire career. So I previously founded a digital marketing company that handled a lot of data on behalf of a lot of its customers. And I ran that company for a very long time, for over a decade. And we, with that business, we regularly encountered challenges in how we would comply with future regulations like the GDPR. And if you cast your mind back here, although many of your listeners and you will be sort of experts in privacy for your entire career, in many respects for technology companies or data-driven businesses, they've only really concretely thought about the risk related to sort of trust and governance in privacy, probably in the last decade at most. And so many of them address privacy in the sort of typical fashion, right, which is imposing governance on systems, that is to say compliance workflows, process management, policy enforcement, et cetera, and all very valid things to do. But as a data engineer, what I found surprising about that in my previous business was it was two systems working asynchronously. That is to say, there was the sort of legal and governance side of the business and the software and data engineers building systems. And they were often at sort of a cultural loggerhead, right? They don't have the same objectives or goals as organizations. And there's a lack of understanding for engineers in often how to do privacy well. And so that left me spending a lot of time thinking about how we might make software inherently more trustworthy in its design. So how could we consider in the way of privacy by design, but at a software engineering level, how could we consider some of those capabilities so they become features of software rather than things you bolt on afterwards as a process? And so I spent a number of years working on prototypes until we got to what has become Ethyca. I think it's about 3 years old now. And we focus on essentially trying to provide tools to other teams of developers and data engineers to help them make more respectful systems on behalf of their users.
That's fascinating. I am a data nerd. So I decided, 10, 15 years ago, become like a webmaster, just to understand how the internet works. So I'm like an expert in SEO and stuff. And I was kind of shocked about flow of data and stuff. And people just don't understand that, right? They don't understand how data flows and the different things that happen to data. And we'll talk about that as well. But one thing that you mentioned, and I think is really interesting, what you talked about is this gap, right? There's a gap between privacy, as people think of it as policy, a checkbox type exercise, right? So if I put a cookie banner and I put a box, I'm good. And then there's kind of this operational part of privacy, right? So when I think about privacy, even when I think about companies that run afoul of regulation, right, and they get fined, I've not seen anybody get fined because they didn't understand the law. They got fined because they couldn't operate, right, or something operationally that they couldn't translate. And so talk to me about how you're finding bridging that gap, those two sides, the legal side and then the operational side of privacy.
Absolutely. Well, Debbie, you've nailed the problem, right? Which is often organizations that have let's call it a substantial enough amount of data for it to be a real critical risk. They have pretty well-oiled governance structures, right? So they're good at managing the sort of policy aspect of privacy and governance, right? And as you say, very often if you examine failures that result in a fine, let's say, or some kind of enforcement action, you'll find that it's not an organization that intentionally did bad or is like terrible human beings. Often they're mistakes made at the operational level or a lack of ability to impose the policy onto the operations, right? So you end up with often incredible reporting tools in the governance suite, right? So the GRC side of the house often has great reports that say that we understand where data is, but actually nobody's lying. Everyone's trying very hard to keep that accurate, but it often doesn't reflect how quickly an organization's data models adjust, right? So you mentioned, people don't understand where data is flowing. Often software engineers are building things so fast and adding new systems and modifying the technology landscape of a business so quickly that it doesn't maintain parity with the governance model, right? Like it's just not able to keep up. And so then when you look at things like enforcing a user's rights request, like a data subject request or an erasure request, that's almost impossible because you don't actually know where the data is because it's changing on a daily or weekly basis. And then if you say you want to sort of enforce data minimization controls and ensure that we're not excessively collecting or using data for some sort of limited purposes, it's almost impossible to do because you don't actually know what you're using the data for, or where it resides, or where it's going. And of course, the logical place to start is data mapping, and that is the right sort of step at the early stages of a privacy program. But very often you'll find that becomes this labor-intensive process led by the governance entity. And often the engineers don't understand its value or purpose, and they're not heavily involved. And so the systems continue to be built at pace, and they quickly diverge, right? The things you've built and the software and data you operate looks very different to the policies you've governed. And so when you say, bridging that gap, it's quite literally what we've spent the last sort of 3.5 years doing, right? Which is trying to understand how you would create tools that you could give to any developer to lower the bar for privacy. And when I say lower, I don't mean lower the quality of privacy, but make it easy for every developer to implement some tools that would make it very easy to observe and instrument or identify what data is in what system, how it's being used, and what it's being used for, without the need for a human being to continuously update that. So that then, if you have that context, so if I can tell you concretely what kind of data exists in all systems and what it's being used for, like I can evidence that, now you can write policies on top of that, right? You can say, okay, we don't use these types of data together for these purposes, or we simply don't allow these purposes at all. Those enforcements become very easy because you have total context to actually control the data. And so our focus is to provide those tools to those developers and the education and capability to make that easy for them as part of their existing workflows. So it's very low friction as a promise for the developer. And the benefit then is for everybody, right? Software and data engineers understand their systems better. They can move very quickly still and be agile, while the governance organization can sort of write very responsive policies to changes in regulation or internal business conditions without the need to sort of rebuild things.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love the way that you're attacking the problem. But let's talk about data mapping. Okay. So this is a term that's overused and it means so many different things to different people. So describe to me how data mapping happens in your world and how it's maybe different. I've seen people pull out Excel spreadsheets and say, hey, I have a server in Cleveland and, whatever, and I'm done. It's like, no, that's not it. Or I've seen people go through like excruciatingly ridiculous detail. It just makes no sense. And then it's so detailed that it doesn't say the operation changes tomorrow and it's totally out of date. It's out of sync. So talk to me about just explaining data mapping from like an operational point of view.
For sure. So my perspective and therefore our teams, the businesses view would be, we'll get to how we see it, but if you think about how it's typically done, there are probably two dominant solutions today, right? There's the sort of human in the loop, like very labor intensive, which you mentioned, spreadsheets and questions and hours of meetings and debates over what system's in and out. And then someone realizes they didn't include the billing system that someone plugged in 2 months ago. And this sort of unknowns all over the place. It's very labor intensive, very hard to maintain. It's often a lot of spreadsheets. And therefore you obviously might end up using a governance tool that allows you to manage those maps. But in truth, most of those governance tools that like the traditional sort of companies that are called privacy technology companies, what they really provide you with is just a way to manage a slightly prettier version of the spreadsheet, right? Like I think it's important to recognize that what they really do is ask you to answer the same questions, but instead of putting the data in a Google Doc, you're putting that information into a sort of slightly prettier dashboard, right? That's one way to solve it. The other, of course, is sort of increasingly people relying on machine learning classifiers to do data discovery, right? And there's a bunch of solutions in that space. The challenge with purely relying on machine learning or data discovery via machine learning and AI is, first of all, is precision or accuracy, right? The world of compliance is a binary. It's not a spectrum of being compliant. What I mean is you can either evidence that you can comply by knowing where data is, or you're out of compliance being that you don't know where data is and you don't know what it is. Machine learning in the sort of best academic environments where it's very precisely trained and managed might get to 88 or 89% accuracy. So that means you've got a 10 or 11% risk of inaccuracy or incorrectly labeled data. The other issue with that approach of machine learning classification is it's essentially boiling the ocean, right? So what I mean by that is what you're doing is saying, I have a legacy of data from my business operations for many decades. And I would now like to plug in something to sift through the data to look for needles in haystacks. And every time my systems change, I will keep doing that, sifting through needles and haystacks in the hope that I never fall out of compliance again. You could do that. It's a very labor and cost and resource intensive way to solve the problem. So the Ethyca approach and the one that we're working with Fides, with our open source developer tools, is very different. We provide a server, quite literally called the Fides control server, and it runs in an organization's infrastructure. So it's configured internally, it's managed internally. We don't host it, you use it yourself. It can connect to source systems like databases and data warehouses. But what its primary purpose, if you start at the sort of the software development lifecycle, is the first thing it does is it allows the organization to describe policies for things they permit and don't permit, like types of data you can use under certain conditions or purpose limitations. So the governance team can write those policies. They're stored in the server, and that server is then connected directly to the work that developers do. So as a developer writes new code, makes changes to systems and connects to new databases, the server is monitoring those checks effectively, and it's enforcing those policies. So if a developer attempted to write a piece of code that was going to use location data and gender data to infer something in a way that the organization at a governance level would say, we don't permit that, that would be prevented. So it would never even get deployed. You could never get to the point where Facebook was misusing phone numbers, because that code would never pass the policy checks that exist in the development process. But the other benefit, aside from being able to enforce that actually in the development process, to ensure that you never deploy anything that isn't compliant, the other side of it is that that evaluation process actually generates metadata. So every time a system is changed, every time a developer adds a column to a database or modifies a data structure or stores new data, it regenerates and updates the data map to reflect the change of the organization. So instead of saying to your developers, hey, well, you work in 2 weekly sprints, and every time you deploy new code, you've got to come back and fill in a privacy review report and then fill in a data map report manually, they continue coding. The server is monitoring, the Fides server is monitoring their commits and generating a metadata layer from the work that they've done. And that then exists in the production environment so that you can report on it. So you can say, well, here is how our map has evolved over time. And it's extremely fine-grained, right down to the sort of data that a service receives and the data the service sends out, and what databases are storing what types of data.
Wow. So you're basically attacking the problem from the opposite way that most people go at it, right? So most time they say, well, let's get a template, let's create a big policy and procedure, and then let's see if we can get people technologically to do this, right? So in a lot of ways, problem with that, and people who aren't technical, the thing that they don't understand is that they may be describing something that can't really be done, right? So they're kind of creating a new problem by imagining the way that data works. So I think the way that you're going at it, it seems more, it should be much easier for organizations, because I always tell organizations, you need to make sure that your policies and procedures match what you actually do. So your policy should be operational, not aspirational, right? So if you can't actually do it, you shouldn't actually say it. So the way that you're doing it is kind of like an evidence-based approach where you're like, okay, this is what this is what's actually happening. You're leveraging the technology to be able to help tell that story. And then based on that story, companies can kind of create policies to align with that.
Exactly, Debbie. I think you've encapsulated it perfectly. It's basically saying, okay, well, there are two different domain experts here. There's the sort of policy and governance experts, and there are the engineers that know what the data is doing. And if you want that to work seamlessly for the benefit of the organization and the software systems you built and the data flowing through it, you need to provide the developer with tools that allow them to very easily provide context, right? Like context or understanding as to what data is flowing where. And if you can do that, you can then enforce actively on it. And to your point, the operation becomes easy, like operational aspect becomes easy because you're essentially able to say, we know precisely what kind of data we have, where it is and what we're using it for. And not just now today for like the GDPR, but for any regulation into the future, we can create new policies and know that we can enforce those consistently on our systems, whatever they are.
Excellent. So tell me, so this is the challenge. This is what I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So because you're attacking the problem from a completely different angle, and most people go at it the opposite way, and also privacy, I think maybe it's opposite to me to cybersecurity. So a lot of people, one of the problems in cybersecurity that we have is that companies may not embrace cyber and the investments they need to make there until something bad happens, right? So we know that privacy requires more proactive, right, attack to the problem. So how do you convince people to proactively embrace the tools that you're doing? What do you see about, your customers, and what is the impetus for them to say, hey, I have to call Ethyca?
Really good question, Debbie. So I think that, there's the sort of, I think we all recognize this sort of secular industry trends, which is that aside from the GDPR and the CCPA and LGPD and people, China, I think, you're a seasoned expert in this space, as are many of your listeners. So for them, privacy has always been present. I think there's a realization that it's become a business critical issue in the last, I would say, 5 years, right? So businesses are increasingly trying to find solutions. The degree of sophistication of the business affects maybe the understanding of the complexity of the problem and therefore the solution they will want. With that said, the approach that we have, which is important, you mentioned customers there, is Ethyca is growing incredibly quickly. And I don't say that out of arrogance, it's because our approach is very different. And what I mean by that is Ethyca is a completely open source business. So our tools are freely available. They are available right now to pull from our publicly available developer repositories on GitHub. Any organization can copy and use that code, modify it to their needs, and continue to leverage it for the privacy purposes. So for example, if you want to do data subject request automation, DSR automation with Ethyca, you can go and pull the public FIDES tools, read the documentation, join the FIDES community, and get it up and running with your own internal IT or technical department in a matter of days at no cost. So there's a huge sort of cost benefit there, right? We don't charge for any of those tools. The other side of it is that our sort of approach is to very much appeal to the part of the organization that is struggling the most with privacy. What I mean by that is that sort of governance and policy teams have a role here to ensure the organization is compliant. For a lot of developers and engineers, it still manifests as an unpleasant friction. It doesn't mean they don't like privacy or security, but their experience of it, their sort of cold face of it in their business is pain, right? Like disagreements over how to do things, delays in shipping code, audit trails, reporting. And what you're going to them and saying is, here are tools that make your users, your customers safer. They will trust in your business more in the future, and it's going to allow you to speed up the way you build things. So these tools just have endless benefits without any friction. That's a very powerful promise, given that they're freely available. Right?
Yeah, the topic of friction is interesting. So I've always been in the mindset that I've seen this happen over and over. People are going to do what's easiest for them, right? So if you can make this process easy for them, reduce friction in the example you gave, people, let's, like you said, someone's going to do a sprint and then they doing this development, and then every 2 weeks they have to go back to the spreadsheet or whatever. We know that just doesn't happen, right? It's just not going to happen. So if you're creating a way, leveraging technology in a way that helps them continue what they're doing, but then also get the evidence or the information in a format that not only they can use, helps them, but also helps parts of the business, I think that's really key.
I totally agree, Debbie. And I think, to give you a concrete example of that point of sort of reducing friction, privacy impact assessments or DP, there's so many names for these things, but DPIAs, privacy impact assessments, privacy reviews. Organizations have multiple ways of doing those, but in business where they're handling a lot of data, they've often created a privacy review process sort of similar to the privacy by design principles, right? Which means that you're asking developers to describe the things that they're building and the business context for why they're building it, perhaps as a team, and what it's doing with what kind of data, so that you can evaluate risk, right? That often is a very labor-intensive process for everybody, right? For the legal or GRC function, for the engineers to describe it. And often there's a translation issue, right? The governance team or policy teams write and speak in a different language and think in a different way to the engineers. So they sort of have to then translate each other's point of view of the world to understand what's actually happening and evaluate the risk. Very sort of manually remediated and labor intensive, even if you use sort of privacy tech tools. Like the pitch to an engineer there to reduce the friction with FIDES is, hey, if you add these tools to the way you build things tomorrow, they will generate reportable impact assessments. They will generate the data that you need to hand to privacy teams to be able to evaluate risks in your code directly, without the need to spend sort of 3 days filling in forms and collecting information. So all of those are sort of huge accelerants that give a developer a reason to adopt the tools and hopefully make that system safer in its delivery.
Yeah. So I want to address a different issue here, and it comes up, right, a lot. So some organizations benefit from the labor intensity of this process. So they may not want to get these efficiencies that you're talking about. Have you ever encountered that?
I have to candidly say not often, but I do know what you're referring to. I say not encountered directly with our clients or customers, but I'm aware in the industry that there is a sort of universe of operational or sort of management around operational privacy that is well-oiled and sort of well process driven and valuable from a point of view of roles and individuals and expertise. I think very transparently, the folks that are in that space that are thinking that way about it probably won't find what we're doing appealing today, right? Because it's designed to sort of streamline that work. I think we, myself, our board, our investors, and our management team look at this with a 10-year view, which is if you assume that we are legitimately racing towards, whether it's the metaverse or not, let's not pick the way it's delivered, but let's assume for a moment that we're racing to some version of the world in which we're spending even more time connected on some data-driven system. It's a scary thought, but we're probably headed there. If that is the reality of things, and that we increasingly rely on machine learning or sort of partially automated tools to power that universe, the volume of data that will be flowing, like the sheer volumes and the complexity of system design that will be processing data, will be very difficult to police or enforce or manage or govern with human beings. It isn't to say humans don't have a role. It is more to say that the scale at which this stuff is happening is already reaching a critical point at which it's very difficult to manage with just humans. Like a sort of random example that has nothing to do with us, but if you think of the moderation problems that Facebook clearly has, like significant problems in moderating content from a trust and ethics standpoint, they are employing thousands of people and they are still not able to bring that issue under control, right? Now, there are many systemic issues at Facebook, arguably, that are a challenge to resolving that. But fundamentally, it is hard to justify that you would police the content of more than 1 billion users with a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand moderators, right? And I take that example to say that if data flows increase in any business as its success increases, the enforcement tooling has to become technology driven, or it's unsustainable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're right. You hit on a big issue. And so I was talking with an investor group yesterday, and I was trying to explain this problem because they were thinking, oh, well, only large companies need these types of technology tools. And it's like, no, it's like the data is increasing exponentially, right? So we're creating much more data than we ever did before. You mentioned the metaverse, we'll be creating even more data than we were before. And so these data problems are gonna hit all types of organizations, big or small. So just because you're, maybe have a small team or, a small group, that doesn't mean that your data problems are small. So being, to me, technology has always been best used when it's helping organizations do kind of the heavy lifting.
I totally agree. And again, I think it's so important to say Ethyca is not in the business of automation to displace users, right? It's actually the opposite, I would say, which is that our recognition would be that governance and policy specialists in privacy and sort of complex regulatory frameworks are domain experts. Their time and energy and expertise is best spent using that strategically to assist the organization in leveraging its data in ways that are acceptable and trustable and sort of evidence-based and respectful on behalf of their users. Developers don't have any of that subject matter expertise and shouldn't have to, right? Their knowledge is in writing that code and building those systems and maintaining them. What we actually need are tools that bridge that gap, right? So that those folks can both respectfully do the tasks that they're best suited to in parallel, while ensuring that the sort of operating systems of the organization are as safe and trustable as they can be on behalf of the users whose data flows through them.
Excellent. Well, tell me, what are you seeing right now? You're definitely someone who's very forward thinking. You kind of see what's happening in the privacy world. What's happening right now in privacy or in technology that's concerning you most?
Well, I could answer this as the parent of two very young kids, or as the person who runs a technology company. I think there's a very personal side of it, which drives some of the business decisions we make anyway. But I think, like, without sounding sort of excessively evangelical, I guess, I think we underestimate already at this stage of where the sort of venture-backed technology industry in particular is. We underestimate the volumes of data that are being collected about individuals and the way in which that data can be used now, but also in the future, right? Like, there's a lot of focus on informed consent and helping a user understand that and avoid dark design patterns, which are all very valuable things that should be solved. But I think we underestimate just the exhaust fumes or trail of data that is generated by every human being on Earth, and where that is being co-located in servers or infrastructure around the world, and how that can be used. One of the things that I talk about internally with our team a lot is, it might seem like a nuanced example. We forget that not very many businesses are enduring. Like, Facebook might last generations and Google does, but we forget that MySpace was the Facebook of 2 generations ago, right? That business was bought cheaply by ultimately News Corp. That was the data of hundreds of millions of users was acquired there. It wasn't the design of MySpace or the user interface. It was the data that was acquired. And I think we'll see a lot of data arbitrage and acquisition over the next 2 decades. And there are very valuable data sets in very small companies. If I were to go out and attempt to bring together 5 failed e-commerce home delivery companies from the last 2 years during the pandemic, I could accumulate a huge amount of user data, which I could use for any number of purposes, depending on how well that's enforced or policed or managed. And so one of the biggest concerns I have is simply a lack of awareness on behalf of end users about the volume of data they're generating and the depth to which that might be used over decades to manipulate, confuse, obfuscate, or do any number of things. That makes me very nervous. It's a very esoteric one, but I think we underestimate just how data will be used over the next couple of decades.
I agree with that. We definitely, first of all, we don't understand all the data that's being collected in the first place, partially because we don't think anyone cares about it, right? Like, so, you would think, who cares that I'll go walk to the coffee shop 3 times a week or whatever? Like, someone somewhere wants to know that. And who knows what they're going to do with it? Maybe they think, oh, a crime was committed around here. Cillian, he walks to the coffee shop 3 times a week or whatever. So you're right. I think there's going to be a lot of data acquisition, right? I know that like the FTC is trying to do all these antitrust cases, but I'm concerned that they're really, they're swinging a big axe, definitely, but they're sort of missing the mark as it relates to sort of data. So, I see. What do you think?
Sorry, go ahead, Debbie. I was going to agree vociferously. Like, I also think the other side of it is the business aspect, Debbie, right? That we're all very, or internally in organizations, they're very focused on privacy compliance at the moment because it's sort of the burning commercial issue. It's about more than that, right? This is about your ability to trust in the governance models of any organization. Are the things the business says they are doing with my information, or any data for that matter, any type of data, true? And can I trust and rely and verify that those are the things that are being done with that data, whether it's about a user, a human, or it's financial records or medical data? And the reason I say that is that, we forget that regulations will evolve. The critical business issue might not be personal data management or governance in 5 years' time. It might be something else. A good example of that is the DSA in Europe, right? The Digital Services Act. When that comes into force, sure, there are some privacy aspects to that, but there are also aspects of that relate to market manipulation and the use of commercial data to essentially drive commercial advantage, right, in an antitrust environment. That starts to drive the need to govern data for totally different reasons. So now if you talk about data maps from a point of view of saying personal data, well, that's not good enough. You need to know all of the types of data that flow through an organization so that you can govern them effectively, so that the business can be trusted in its business promise effectively.
That's fascinating. I totally hope that we see more talk around what I call like data monopolies, right? Where there are companies that are acquiring other companies that really have nothing to do with their core business, because it sort of fills out more detail. They can join together more information about individuals. Definitely.
Absolutely agreed. I think we underestimate the volume and the monopoly or cartel effects of a handful of businesses working together to use that information for their benefit, right? And that will only accelerate. Like, that's not going to slow down.
Yeah. So if it were the world according to Cillian and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy in the future? Whether that be technology, human stuff, legal, what are your thoughts?
So I share this publicly, but we talk about it very often internally in the company, so that if you speak to anybody at Ethyca, they'll tell you, yeah, this is Cillian's soapbox. But I really do believe that software developers have a very powerful role to play, software engineers, software developers, in building safer systems. So we forget that software engineers today are effectively building society's civil infrastructure. So what I mean by that is 30 years ago, software developers were building video games and calculators. And if a calculator breaks, so what, right? And I'm being glib, but it's not a big issue. Nowadays, software engineers want to ship code into the world that might be used or affect the data of 100 million people, and that's success for them. Well, if you're doing that, you're now not building a sort of a calculator or a peripheral technology. You're building civil infrastructure, right? And the truth is, software powers the entire world. You pick an industry and it's powered by software. What you would never see, though, is civil engineers that build bridges wearing T-shirts that say "Move fast and break things," right? Like, you would never cross that bridge if you met a civil engineer wearing a T-shirt that said that. That would be like petrifying, right? But isn't it curious that we allow people who build effectively the systems, the planes in the air, communications going, to move fast and break things? I don't believe we need to move slowly at all, but I think we can build better tools to enable developers to build safer, respectful, and more trustworthy technology on behalf of everybody on the planet. Like, that is my hope. And so if you were to square it as like, what do I hope we achieve, both at Ethyca and therefore for the industry, I hope that we can help to create a standard, and that standard is easy to use for all developers, so there are no excuses to avoid building trustworthy technology on behalf of every user. That should be a baseline. We should all care enough to want to build safe technology for everybody.
I love that answer. Wow, I have to really, really think about that. It's true. I think I've been concerned about bias, bias in systems. It's like, okay, you have a developer, they're doing this code and, they're hitting all the marks for their company, but then, maybe this bit of code helps indicate someone in a crime, for example, right? So let's say someone ends up in jail as a result of something that someone coded. So I feel like that process is disconnected from kind of the human impact there. And so I agree with you that you shouldn't be, breaking things, especially because the things are people, right? So you'll be breaking people if you're doing this the wrong way.
Completely. I think that's just it. We underestimate that. We have a number of large customer users of our technology that use it to increasingly to do what they call explainability in machine learning models. Right now, there are not yet today explicit regulations in that space. There's a lot coming very fast. It's inevitable. But this idea of being able to actually explain what is the computer doing, right, from a point of view of machine learning, and what are the decisions it's making, and how has it arrived at those conclusions. I think that should be mandatory. I don't want to create work for developers. I just think that I, as a software developer, would care enough to make a piece of software that is safe. I think of that, like I say, through the context of my 2 young kids. I don't want to make bridges that fall. I want to make software that's enduring, that lasts for a long time. Right? We should all want that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I say software is not like fine wine, so it doesn't get better with age, right? You definitely have to iterate.
If only it did. If only it did, Debbie.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This was really interesting. I love what you're doing. I like the fact that you are really looking at this gap, and I hope that more companies look at this problem from the same way that you're doing. So you're looking at, okay, this is what actually is happening within the enterprise, and then let's build policies around it as opposed to creating policies, and then let's see how we can do it operationally, which it doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. And I, first of all, thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm happy to always talk to you and share what we're doing. And likewise, I hope that both more companies embrace this approach and we end up with more people competing in this space, because that's only better for our industry, right? So I hope to see it flourish over the coming years.
I agree. Well, we'll definitely talk soon. I love what you're doing, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Debbie. A pleasure.